Alright, this is going to be a lecture on capitalism. Just on the opening slide, you have on the left side Adam Smith, who is one of the premier capitalist writers. First coined the term capitalism in his book The Wealth of Nations. And on the right, you have Karl Marx, who wrote about communism. Now, let's go on to the next slide. First of all, what is capitalism? I used the Google Dictionary definition, which is an economic and political system in which countries' trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. According to Marxists, however, capitalism consists of two different groups: the proletariat class, which consists of workers, and the bourgeoisie, which consists of elites. On the image there shown, you can see there's an economic spectrum where capitalism exists on the right side and communism exists on the left side. There's a lot of misconception that an economy is either a dichotomy between communist and capitalist. This isn't true. It can be a largely capitalist economy with some more left-leaning reform to make it more socialist, or it can be somewhere in between, basically. And on there shown are examples of different countries and where they fall on that spectrum. Notably, the one you should keep note of is the United States right there, towards the pure free enterprise capitalism, because most of the critiques will talk about the United States itself. Moving on, what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism, before I get into the dictionary definition, is largely related to capitalism and the way it operates. Specifically, Investopedia defines neoliberalism as what is written there. Don't want to read the whole thing because that's redundant, but take your time to read it. The image is actually a good example if you're unclear on what the definition looks like in terms of a real-world model where companies, largely American, but also from other privileged, wealthy nations, spread their influence to other countries. Now, we start with the negative arguments, which is what are some problems with capitalism or neoliberalism. I will go over each of those four terms in details, but the first is surplus value, the second is overconsumption, the third is the root cause of oppression, and the fourth is that it reduces people to objects. Let's specifically start with surplus value. First, there's the concept of labor power, which is the worker's capacity to provide goods and services. This is usually measured by how many hours it takes to produce stuff, and how much clothes and shelter a worker needs to survive. And next, if it's true that all goods and services in a capitalist society that cost their true value, how is it possible that capitalists can enjoy profits? If everyone is given their fair share, there would be no classes. This is what Marx calls an internal contradiction. Capitalism underpays workers but keeps the price of goods the same. The labor that is then extracted from the people as less than the good itself is called the surplus value. As written there, the formal definition is the extra work that the worker puts in to their work that they don't get paid for. There's a control aspect to this. The bourgeoisie wants to continue their power over the proletariat, and one way to do this is to exploit their labor. The second fault is overconsumption. There are two reasons, at least main ones that I discuss, that capitalism causes overconsumption. The first is that capitalism inherently incentivizes growth, which in theory expands infinitely to the point where there are no more resources on Earth. For example, capitalism or capitalist economies are largely measured by metrics such as GDP that value growth as a good thing, and thus business owners are incentivized to have more growth as an attempt to get more profit. This means that they consume resources at a faster and faster pace to the point where there are none left on Earth. The second is that competition means that cutting costs is incentivized within businesses. And when cutting costs is incentivized, that means businesses are less likely to use green technology and resources to be able to create their products. This means that they go to more dirty forms of energy that are cheaper and exploit resources that are considered cheaper to extract and sometimes more useful to people. The two images contextualize the ways that capitalism is able to exploit resources. The first being more of the talking about how they literally extract resources from the ground, and the second being more about the waste that they cause. And then why is overconsumption bad? It should be fairly obvious why overconsumption is bad, but this is just the way it's articulated in terms of debate impacts. The first is warming. Obviously, if we consume resources at a really fast pace, it would hurt the environment as a whole and also produce way more emissions, which means warming happens quicker. The second is that we need resources to live. This one should be fairly obvious and self-explanatory. We need food, water, and literally the earth needs to be intact in order for people to live. The third is that it worsens the harms of capitalism by furthering the class divide because only the rich can adapt. When overconsumption happens, the people that will be able to survive and live similarly to the lifestyle before overconsumption took place is the rich people who are able to buy technology and make financial adaptations that would allow them to survive in this economy, whereas the poor and middle class are the ones who get stuck basically feeling the worst harms of overconsumption. Next is that many articulate capitalism as the root cause of oppression. A few reasons why capitalism causes oppression. The first is that elites create divisions to ensure no proletariat revolution. Basically, Marx's theory relies on the working class being able to unite and rise up over the bourgeoisie or elite class. But the thing is that elites realize they can manipulate this by being able to create divisions like race, gender, sexuality, etc., to be able to keep the working class antagonized and hating within each other so that they won't be able to unite. The second one is that many debaters use slavery as an empirical example for why cap needs racism for profit. When European colonizers first came to America, they first enslaved indigenous people, but then indigenous people knew their way around America and thus were more easily able to escape. But capitalism ensured that white people were able to use racism to try and extract as much of a profit as possible, and thus brought over Africans to be enslaved. That is an example of how cap came logically prior to racism happening in the first place, thus creating cap as a root cause of oppression. The third is that it has caused imperialism throughout history. I outlined two examples. The first is the Iraq War, which many anti-capitalists claim was caused by capitalism because the United States wanted oil within the Middle East, which means under the guise of pretending to want regime change, freedom, and democracy, the United States had ground troops march in, kill innocent people, and basically destroy the country, all for the pursuit of a natural resource. The second was the spheres of influence in China during the early 20th century, where European countries and the United States came into China, basically partitioned off different parts of China, be able to take their resources and use them for trade. This was an example of how countries in search of profit decided to be able to quite literally carve up countries for their own use and be able to essentially colonize them. The fourth is the creation of the nuclear family. Capitalism has incentivized the nuclear family, which is the traditional husband, wife, and two kids model, because they need to be able to create as many workers as possible. This creates gender divisions where there's sort of a male patriarch in control of a relationship, and it's two, also is heteronormative because it excludes the possibility of non-hetero sexual relationships because that's not incentivized under capitalism. And so people use any combination of these explanations to be able to explain why capitalism is the root cause of all oppression. Next is that capitalism reduces people to objects. There's a few reasons why it reduces people to objects. The first is that workers are only valued by the profit they create and are only valued by their employers by the wages they earn. This makes workers seem replaceable because they're essentially just cogs in a machine that can be easily replaced by a different person who is willing to do it for a shorter cost. And also, workers not valued for themselves as a person. It's just what do they add to the company by making money, and that they're only valued in turn by the money they receive, which is significantly less than the profit they earn. The second is that workers are detached from the products they create. There's no creative input by the worker in the products they make. It's all decided by the elites in charge, who are able to decide what products they want to make. This means the worker essentially just creates objects without any sort of thought placed into it, which makes them basically just laborers. There's a few reasons, or the main reason why this is explained as bad within debate is that it kills value to life. By the way, VTL is an acronym for value to life. I will be using a lot in this presentation. Basically, that if people essentially are robbed of their autonomy by capitalism, then their lives are valueless. This is used as a sort of K-trick to be able to minimize death or oppression impacts that the AF has. The United will stand up here and explain this in the NR as, well, if life is meaningless in the first place, then concepts like death and suffering don't really matter because suffering is already the worst it can possibly be. Basically, death is essentially better than living in perpetual, tyranny. Next is the alternatives to cap the neg presents. These are usually the weakest part of the critique and, are usually explained as such during cross-ex. The three main ones I've broken it down into are: the first is communism, the second is just reject the AF. I'll get into that in specifics more on that slide. And the third is historical materialism. The bottom image of the underpants gnomes from South Park articulate a main conception that an author, Levi Bryant, brings up to most critique alternatives, which is just a lack of explanatory power and method. Moving on now, the first one is communism, which is not that common in debate, more common in, I guess, if you meet an anti-capitalist outside of a debate context, so it's important to go over. Basically, it starts by proletariats rising up and overthrowing the bourgeoisie. I went over that earlier, but that's basically how it starts, and once that has happened, people are finally paid what their stuff is worth. This solves for the first inherent harm that I brought up in this PowerPoint, which is surplus value, that workers are able to basically essentially take what their product is worth, and they're able to decide what their product is worth. Next is that there's only one class. There's no class division between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. There's just the workers. The workers get to decide what everything is worth and how much should be made. They essentially control the entire economy, and excesses don't exist under communism because there is no surplus value. The reason we think specialization is good is because we have an assumption that a business executive is contributing more for the greatest good in society. The business executive is not producing for society, but is producing for the bourgeoisie. The working class being able to decide the price of goods solves for this because they get to actually control the economy. Next is the reject the AF, or capitalism as a whole. I will just be using reject the AF in each of these explanations, but it's interchangeable with the words capitalism. The first is the one I think personally is the strongest, which is reject the AF because it is unethical. Basically, that if we are winning, our impacts to capitalism are true. That it reduces people to having no value in life, that it causes all this suffering, causes oppression, then it's obviously a system we should not partake in, and thus not doing the AF is a good idea. The second one is reject the AF and eventually figure out what economic system we should use. Obviously, it would not be articulated with this within the NC shell of the CapK, but during cross-ex, if you say, what alternative system of economics should we use, this is an answer a lot of people give, or at least imply. The third one is reject the AF just in this room, between the AF debater, neg debater, and judge, which basically this is kind of similar to the first one, but articulated in a different way, I guess. The fourth is that people everywhere just decide to reject capitalism. This one is usually an example of fiat abuse, because it's essentially just saying that, we change everyone in America's minds. There are 300 million Americans, most of whom are staunchly in favor of capitalism. To have them just be able to wake up one day and reject it is probably not a legitimate alt, and this one is probably the weakest of the five. And the fifth one is reject the AF through protests. The picture is an empirical example of an anti-capitalist protest. The most famous one is Occupy Wall Street. And honestly, the empirical examples of protests are actually ones you can use to prove why those protest alts empirically fail, is because those protests happen, capitalism still exists, nothing changed. The third type of alternative, and a very common one, is historical materialism, which the definition is written there, analyzing the history of wage relations that have occurred through capital and the way that has created conditions for the present and oppression. The diagram, although small, provides an example of this, where they trace capital all the way from feudalism to capitalism to socialism, and talks about the thesis, which was the dominant or wealthy party at the time, and the antithesis, which was considered the working class or the oppressed class at the time, and that history was a series of the antithesis defeating the thesis and eventually becoming the same sort of oppressive power as the thesis. So analyzing this throughout history, and a lot of K debaters will be vague about who does this alt, whether or not it's something that happens within this round or that they fiat people doing this. I would say it's good to understand who is doing the alt in all cases, and this one especially, and also how this one, and also make sure to understand how K debaters will try and explain this as a way to solve their impacts. Next is the AF answers. There are three main categories of answers. The first is link turns. These are specific to the AF, so they won't be addressed by this presentation that much. The second is impact turns. I've outlined 6 categories for those. Each of those gets a slide. And then a general alt fails, which I kind of went over the basics of implicitly when going over what the neg alt looks like, but I'll go over those more explicitly when I get there. The first impact turn is poverty/structural violence, that capitalism is good for these things. The first way that this is true is that empirics prove that capitalism is best for these things. Since the spread of global capitalism, the three main factors outlined here. First is that global GDP has risen. This means that people earn higher incomes and are able to live better. If nations as a whole are wealthier, that usually goes down to the level of the common people, which means essentially life is good. Second is life expectancy has risen. This one's pretty self-explanatory that as capitalism, there's a correlation between capitalism and life expectancy. It means life has gotten better. The third is that deaths from wars have increased. This one will be more articulated within the second impact turn, or whatever number I put it, of war. The second is that there's alt causes to things like poverty and structural violence. Among them are nationalism, ethnic or religious conflict, corruption, lack of education. If they bring up a specific example, it's better to articulate a specific alt cause to that event that they bring up. But a lot of the times, negs will stand up and say capitalism is the reason why poverty exists in the first place, but you can point to these specific examples as things that might have caused poverty. The third is that cap causes technological innovation, which alleviates poverty. Things like that kind of goes with like an increased standard of living, that you can invent ways for poor people, even if they can't afford certain things, to make their lives better. Instead of being homeless, to be able to build cheap homes, to be able to have cheap food, things like that. A lot of these cap impact turns will rely on capitalism incentivizing innovation, because that's unique to capitalism, because when there's a profit motive, it means people have more of an incentive to be creative, to be able to undercut their competition, versus in communism, there's less of an incentive to do that because there's A, no competition, and B, there's no profit motive, which means you can keep providing the same product over and over again. The fourth is that capitalism is best for food supply, since collectivized farming fails. This was proven during the Great Leap Forward in Mao's China, that their agriculture failed and led to mass starvation. In Soviet Russia, there was a lot of examples of their farming just failing and massive famines happening, which means that capitalism is able to allow for exchange of goods, and agriculture that actually succeeds means people won't starve. Now, next impact turn is war. The main theory here is McDonald's theory. This is a quote from a CBS article I have hyperlinked in the presentation, which is that it's created by Thomas L. Friedman, that no two countries with McDonald's within their borders have ever been in a war since having a McDonald's, because those countries are so economically tethered that they have no stake to go to war. This basically sums up the best reason why capitalism decreases war. Trade and other products being exchanged across borders means that there's absolutely no reason to go to war. If the United States and China both rely on each other for, let's just say, like steel and oil, then the United States would not want to risk their steel supply to go to war with China, since that would hurt their country more, and China likewise would not want to go to war with the United States because they need their oil. I don't think that's a true example, but just to explain how the concept works. The second is that it decreases state violence because the state has less stake in the economy and thus less incentive to commit violence. Many communist and non-capitalist governments throughout history have been very tyrannical and have had a major stake within the economy, since they essentially control the economy. When states don't have as much control in the economy, they have less incentive to control their people and thus have less of a need to commit violence. The third is that capitalism allows for sanctions that would decrease the chances of war. Trade makes countries a lot of money, so when countries suddenly get cut off from that trade and are penalized, it means that they have more of an incentive to A, not go to war with other countries, B, improve the conditions of life within their own country, which means that ultimately it kind of also solves for quality of life in other countries and also war between nations. The next impact turn is the environment. The first way that capitalism helps the environment is by allowing for market solutions like a carbon tax. A carbon tax is basically that you get charged a certain dollar amount contextualized by the social cost of carbon for every X number of tons of carbon you emit. This only happens under a system like capitalism because taxes don't exist under communism, since there's no wages, property, or anything like that would necessitate taxes. The second is that wealthier countries are more willing to sacrifice production for environmental regulations. Less wealthy nations don't really want to sacrifice the few good things their economy have going for them for the sake of the environment. But wealthier nations are able to do that since they're so strong and have such a good economy. They're able to sacrifice some of that in favor of environmental regulation. which means that, and only capitalism can create wealthier nations as opposed to less wealthy ones due to things like trade. The third is the one that I articulated under poverty, which is innovation. Innovation means that there's less of a need to consume resources and allow for tech that can retroactively solve warming. An example of a concept of this, of course this does not exist, is the space vacuum, which can decarbonize the atmosphere. Something like the space vacuum, which obviously does not exist yet, would have more of an incentive to be made under capitalism where someone can profit off of it, as opposed to someone doing it for, like, the collective good of society. The last thing is that property rights mean that people actually care about treating the earth properly. This is opposed to the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is a concept that dictates that when something is a shared societal or collective good, people treat it terribly. An example of this is parks that are available for use by the public tend to get treated worse than someone's backyard because they're private property. This means that property rights mean that people treat the earth better since they have more of, like, a stake in it themselves, as opposed to assuming someone else will clean it up after them. Next is that capitalism is sustainable or inevitable. Many capitalism critiques argue about late-stage capitalism, i.e. capitalism is on the brink of collapse. This impact turn both answers that and makes no unique benefit to voting neg. Even if they win that capitalism is the worst thing in the world, if capitalism is inevitable and the AF saves at least one life, then there's no disadvantage to doing the AF since you'll never be able to solve the larger systemic harms that the neg talks about. So there's a slight difference in sustainability and inevitability. Sustainability means basically that capitalism, it will survive, will, like, adapt and be able to solve for its harms and will not, like, run out of resources, versus inevitable means that no matter how hard someone tries to change capitalism or whatever economic system, capitalism will always be there. So first, why capitalism is sustainable. The first that the neg solution, or the alt, is too ivory tower and utopian. The reasons for that will be covered more in the alt section. But basically, if their solution is always going to be never feasible in the real world, then capitalism is going to sustain, because they don't have a good method for getting rid of capitalism. The second is that capitalism is self-correcting through reforms. The two examples of this I'll point out here is the first is the 2008 recession, where Obama made many reforms that were able to save the housing market and be able to recover the economy that collapsed under President Bush. And the second is the Great Depression, where President FDR was able to create the New Deal and many different infrastructure jobs that were able to recover the economy from the Great Depression. These two examples prove that there are various reforms that can solve for the worst forms of capitalism. Those two, like, recessions and depression I mentioned, are considered like some of the worst forms of capitalism since there's mass starvation and poverty, but reforms are able to at least mitigate some of that, which means that it proves that it could eventually be mitigated more. Next, why capitalism is inevitable. The first is that it's way too entrenched in society. Like, this is kind of what I mentioned when the alt people wake up and decide communism is the right solution one day and capitalism is bad, is that it's just not feasible. Like, Trump is president right now. He is furthering capitalism a lot. There are people who will cling to their property no matter what. It means that it's never just going to actually happen. It's America, like, which is considered one of the most capitalist countries, as proven by the spectrum I had in the second slide. And a second reason is that it's just human nature, that human psychology dictates that traits like selfishness and envy are something that we have, which means that we'll never be able to share something for the greater collective good and always are acting in our own self-interest and necessitating a need for profit. Those are two main tenets of capitalism. The third is that most nations that have abandoned capitalism have eventually reverted back to it. The example I brought up here in the presentation is China, which eventually, under Mao, rose to have a communist government, but has since made many capitalist reforms, allowing for things like trade. And, I mean, it's functionally capitalist at this point because of its so many reforms that have moved it away from communism. Another example is the USSR, which, of course, collapsed, and under Gorbachev had many reforms that allowed it to have more economic freedom, which means that most countries that have adopted it have gone back on it. There are obviously a few small exceptions, but those exceptions, such as like Cuba, won't really help the neg make their point that alternatives to capitalism are ethical. Next impact turn is value to life. This one is an important one to answer because because of the K trick I mentioned earlier. This is a way to prevent the neg from being able to stand up and grandstand on value to life. The first is that capitalism ensures that people are self-interested and has an emphasis on individualism, while alts to cap reduce people to part of a collective. Basically, capitalism ensures that, like, people are able to choose their own destiny, are able to choose their own job, are able to have any sort of bargaining power, are able to take actions that benefit themselves as opposed to society as a whole. Um, like Adam Smith's, one of his three tenets was about individualism and self-interest as being one of the main functions of capitalism. So if everyone has autonomy, then that obviously disproves the next claim that capitalism reduces autonomy to nothing. The second is that empirics in capitalist countries prove that capitalism increases value to life. The three examples I've outlined here are: first is human rights, the existence of things like free speech and being able to vote, prove that there's some sort of element of choice within society, and prove that people are actually individuals as opposed to replaceable entities. The second is an increase in standard of living. This kind of ties in with innovation, but the way capitalism creates innovation ensures that people are able to live their lives to the fullest. And the third is democracy. Some argue, and there's a lot of literature on this, that non-capitalist economies and democracy are mutually exclusive. And if you can win that argument, and democracy is the best form of government that allows for the most value to life, then you have your capitalism increases value to life claim. The third way is that the only way elites can succeed is by creating a product that the working class wants, which sort of answers the alienation from the product argument that the neg could make. This is not as strong as the other two arguments, in my opinion, but still a good one to have. The last impact turn is reform good. Most capgays argue that reform within capitalism is harmful, since it as a system is inherently harmful and unethical, and thus we should not even try to work within it, and it always ends up harming people. Reform good can function either as a link turn if you have it to the specific plan, or just an impact turn as a whole, but it still characterizes that cap can be good in some instances, so I put it in the impact turn category. I would say most of the time it functions as a link turn, but it doesn't really matter. An important point is that reform good is a good argument to use against capitalism critiques. Why reform is good? The first is what I've been hinting at a lot throughout this presentation, and will say more explicitly when I get to the alt section. Vague solutions like the K-alt are bad. Reform is the only solution. Basically, as the thing in the top right corner indicates, that when you want to be able to solve for the harms of capitalism, you can either reform it or have a revolution. If you can win that reform is the more common sense, less harmful option, you have won reform good, and you can point out your AF as a specific good instance of reform. The second is that empirics prove that reform within capitalism is good and able to alleviate the harms of capitalism. Some examples include the minimum wage, because that solves for some of the wage exploitation. The second is that working conditions that have to be met, like you can't work within awful sweatshops in America. You can't have insane hours, like there are only certain hours you're able to have per week, which means that reforms that happened especially after the Industrial Revolution and that we know today are able to alleviate a lot of the harms of capitalism. When capitalism was first sort of talked about as a concept, and when Marx wrote about it, it was way more had way more exploitation because it didn't have a lot of the reforms that we know today in America. So if you can point out, make the neg defend why these reforms are bad things. Make them defend why is it bad to not have child labor laws, because that essentially is what the Cap K justifies, and makes the neg look morally repugnant. Lastly is the alt fails section. Once again, the alts are the weakest parts of these Ks. If you think there's any chance any of the alts outlined I mentioned happen, it's pretty unlikely. There are a few reasons the alts are bad. The first is see the political. This basically means that an extreme absence of the left not engaging in politics ensures that the right, far right, takes over and implements bad policies that harm people. A lot of people say that Trump was an example of a see the political argument, where the left political spaces didn't really vote that much and Trump took over. And a lot of neg arguments will use this as sort of a try or die argument, but I would say that the AF can always make the argument that it always can get worse. The second argument is transition wars, which are that in transition from capitalism and to communism, The revolution they talk about would not be peaceful. It would have to be very violent and ultimately cause more deaths than capitalism would create, or somehow unethical in the same ways that capitalism is. The third is that it would lead to tyrannical governments. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot in the literature about how non-capitalist economies and democracy are mutually exclusive. Empirical examples of this are like Stalin and Lenin in Soviet Russia, Mao in China, the Kim Jong-un or Il in North Korea. That don't allow for freedom of choice among consumers, don't allow for freedom of speech a lot. The fourth is that it would take too long, which means we wouldn't be able to solve immediate problems. For example, warming, you can make an argument, is something that we have to solve right now. And if we have a revolution or some sort of way to transition from capitalism, we would not be able to solve warming in the time frame necessary. The second is that the people that that the neg talked about are suffering right now from capitalism would obviously not be able to be helped by a non-capitalist revolution right now because they're suffering. They're dying, they're starving, they're being exploited by their employers. It doesn't make sense to just ignore those people for the time being and say, well, eventually you're not going to be exploited, eventually you're not going to be starving, eventually you're not going to be dying. That's obviously repugnant also. And those are the arguments for why capitalism is good and why capitalism is bad.